But I have not prepared a thorough, comprehensive treatment of what everyone has said. I have selected things that I think are particularly worth commenting on. And just, okay, Martin said at the start of this discussion, we need evidence to answer our questions. And improve systems that best suit our collective needs. But I think that is already conceding too much, as if there is one common set of needs. One common set. In fact, let me use that mic, and then I can get away from that one, and then I can pace around and point with my stick. There isn't one set of questions. When a company is trying to market a product, the question they ask is not, is it safe, but can we generate the evidence and data required to get over the regulatory hurdles? If you're in the public health business, you ask an entirely different question, namely, is there any evidence that this product might constitute a hazard or a risk? So there isn't one set of questions. Their questions may not be the same as our questions. Yes, corporate organisations and, for that matter, public-private partnerships don't just want a, it's true, they don't just want a favourable regulatory regime, they do also want subsidies for their R&D. Next slide, please. Okay. And then Martin said, how do you escape lobbyists? Oh, this may be what you might think is a trivial linguistic point about the English language, but let me just explain where that idea of a lobbyist comes from. And it's a sort of parliamentary image that you can imagine in Westminster. The idea is that decisions get made either within the House of Commons or in the minister's office, whereas the lobbyists are outside the location where decisions are made and try to influence it from the outside. But I think that's often the wrong image. Often people who are called lobbyists are on the inside making the decisions, and therefore to call them the lobbyist is already conceding too much. Yes, of course, José Bové is correct that he's not anti-science, but he asks in which direction science is developing, and I think that's an important way of framing the issue, because science does not move inevitably in one single direction. So, the development of knowledge has directionality. People choose to explore some questions and neglect others. And so there's an important question about which direction it goes in and how the agendas are set, which is not a question that can be settled by scientists within science. It is a question of power over and in science, and to pretend otherwise is to miss the point. Yes, he did call for a moratorium on GM technology, but until we know what the impacts are. So he wasn't saying, I'm anti-science. I would interpret him as asking for more and better science as a condition for accepting that particular technology. And of course, for a reallocation of EU research funds. I mean, yeah, people say, oh, look at the productivity of organic ag per hectare or per worker or per unit of capital. It might be low, but then it's had vanishingly slight amounts of, which also, okay, it's not low per unit area, but it is quite low per unit of labour and so on. But it's had vanishingly small amounts of investment in R&D, in levels of investment that I would almost call homeopathic by comparison with the monumental amounts of money that have gone into commercial agriculture. Yeah, so we want transparency, but transparency is not enough. He said we need new ways to assess these scientific debates. Let's go on. Oh, yes. Naomi Oreskes highlighted, yes, industrial corporations recruit scientists and I like this, other credible people. So how does that work? Let me give you an answer. Next slide. I found this quote. The source was given on that previous slide, but time is short. What matters is what this quote says. It's just spectacular. I love reading this to my students. Regulatory policy is increasingly made with the partition of experts, especially academics. A regulated firm, now I should explain. The authors of this book are American industrialists, and this is the kind of book that would never be written in Britain because the Brits are too subtle and delicate. There's wonderful straightforwardness of we're just out to get regulatory capture, and this, folks, is how you do it. A regulatory firm should be prepared, whenever possible, to co-opt these experts. This is the best bit, which is why I've put it in italics. This is most effectively done by identifying the leading experts in each relevant field and hiring them as consultants and advisors, or giving them research grants and the like. This activity requires a modicum of finesse. It must not be too blatant, for the experts themselves must not recognize that they've lost their objectivity and freedom of action. At a minimum, a program of this kind reduces the threat that the leading experts will be available to testify right against the interest. So it is. So actually, people say to me. So I talk to regulatory scientists who are acting as paid consultants of the companies whose products they're evaluating, and they say, "But I don't say what I say because they pay me." To which I reply, no, that may be true, but it's because you say what you say that you are the people they choose to give money to, and you are the people they choose to nominate to go onto those panels. Oh yes, of course Naomi's right. Firms often restrict publication of unfavourable results. How might we deal with this? Well, one rule could be, and this is what the British Medical Association and others are trying to introduce into the medical field. You say that companies can only submit data in support of an application to market a product if the study is registered before it starts with its protocol and intended completion date, and all registered research must subsequently published at the earliest opportunity. And that would hopefully get over this business of companies doing studies and only releasing the results of the ones that give them results that favour their output. Okay, yes, okay. I will endeavour not to spend too long in the philosophical stratosphere. But I did a physics degree several centuries ago, and while doing that I did succumb to a severe attack of philosophy from which I have almost complete remission of symptoms, but nonetheless I'll try and respond to what I think is a very important challenge from Silvio, which is how to recognize, how to achieve and how to reconcile scientific and democratic legitimacy. Yes, which leads to Lizette's question about how much evidence is enough. Next slide, please. Okay. All right. This isn't my attempt to provide a graphic representation of some of the ways in which the role of science in policy has been conceptualized. And I would argue that certainly until the mid to late 90s, at the European Commission, what I would call a technocratic model was adopted. This was the basis of a narrative legitimating how policy was made, but also was reflected in the institutional structure. And the claim was, well, policy was based on and only on science, and we have the facts, and the facts decide what policy was made. I mean, we heard this most frequently in the United Kingdom in relation to bovine spongiform encephalopathy, mad cow disease, Rinderwahnsinn, la vache folle, call it what you will. Margaret Thatcher, I lost count of the number of times she would stand up in Parliament and say, "We are doing what and only what our experts tell us." What she didn't say is, we decided what the policy would be first, and then we chose only those experts that would give us the advice that we've already decided we want to receive. So instead of having evidence-based policy making, we had policy-based evidence selection and expert selection. But after the BSE crisis of '96, which I like to characterize as the worst catastrophe in British public policy between the Suez Crisis of '56 and the invasion of Iraq in 2003. We got a new account of science in public policy making, which derives from the US and the 1986, is it? Was it book? Yes, a risk assessment in the federal government, right, known as the Red Book, because it was printed with a red cover. And this was a different model, and I should explain that in these graphs, it's color-coded, which might be evident to those of you who are less colorblind than me, but I'm using blue to symbolize the cool qualities of science and red for the heat of politics. Okay, so the idea on this model is that, yes, policy making still starts from science, and it gets the facts, and risk assessments are then passed to policymakers, so facts are separate from values, and in the light of the advice from scientists, policymakers, taking into account legitimately non-scientific considerations such as values and interests and practicalities, and also to some extent the uncertainty in the science, then decide what is the right thing to do and then tell the public and industry to do it. But both of those models are seriously misleading. They're both exceedingly popular. I would characterize this model currently as the official orthodoxy of the European Union, the Commission, European Food Safety Authority, the World Health Organization, the US FDA, and many institutions. But it's seriously misleading because, of course, science does not act in a policy vacuum. There is not just, as I said, there's not just one set of questions, there are multiple questions that can be asked, and therefore if you'll oblige me with the next slide, I'll offer my alternative model, which yes, there is of course an indispensable role for science in public policy, doing expert assessments informed by scientific evidence, but that expert assessment is always dependent upon prior upstream assumptions about what's the relevant question, what counts as relevant evidence, and how much evidence is sufficient. Could we just go back one slide? Because an important distinction between this model here and the next one is in this model, the arrow only goes in one direction. So it portrays science as influencing policy, but policy never influences science. If we come to this one, in reality, expert assessments are always framed by some prior upstream assumptions, which are essentially risk management assumptions of a political kind, which frame the assessment. I'll give you a couple of examples, if I've got time. In the European Union, let's do it the other way. Let's do the US first. When the US considers the environmental impact of genetically modified crops, the question they ask is, does the cultivation of these GM crops cause changes to the environment that would adversely affect the finances and economics of US farmers? Otherwise, it's not an adverse effect, it's an adaptation. In Europe, that was not considered as an adequate question, first, because, of course, our agricultural and non-agricultural environments are much more closely integrated, and so the question was initially, in the mid-90s, would the cultivation of these crops cause significant changes to flora and fauna in the environment? Well, initially they only asked about direct short-term changes, and then Parliament pushed them into looking at long-term and indirect changes. And so, which question gets asked, what evidence gets incorporated, is influenced by these prior framing assumptions. And very interestingly, for reasons that I struggle to understand, the Codex Alimentarius Commission back in 2003 started to recognize this. they introduced this term risk assessment policy, and they said risk assessment policy, as it were, prior to any risk assessment taking place, risk managers should specify the risk assessment policy to the risk assessors, making clear what the question should be, what the evidence should be, and what the criteria of interpretation are. But curiously, Codex is not implementing its own guidance. And even more remarkably, the guidance that Codex agreed to for itself in 2003 was then agreed to by all member states of Codex in 2007, and that's supposed to apply to all member states of the EU and, of course, to the European Commission, which is a member of Codex. Curiously, none of them are implementing this guidance, but my claim is that in practice, well, you've got multiple contested ways of framing risk assessment, and risk assessments are, as it were, sandwiched between some upstream political judgments and some downstream political judgments, for instance, about trade-offs between costs and benefits and so on. And if you take a model like this and implement it properly, I would contend that it provides the means to answer the question that Silvio asked about the conditions under which you can reconcile scientific and democratic legitimacy. And if you would move on to the next slide, I'd be grateful. Oh, yes. So, moving on rapidly. Oh, yes, I think what Sylvain was talking about, I think, was what could be called technocratic internationalism. And of course, when you have multiple member states coming together, each with different policy agendas, and you can't resolve those, you can't readily reach a political consensus, the way to do it is, well, tell you what, let's give it to the scientists and lock them in a room until they agree, and then we'll call that, as it were, the scientific solution to the policy problem. And he's explained its origins, but I don't think, I'm not so sure he's explained its persistence and resilience. Yeah, sorry. You might be familiar with the term NGOs, non-governmental organizations. I think it's worth differentiating between different kinds of NGOs. So for me, a bingo is the business interest NGO, and public interest NGOs are pingos. So we should differentiate pingos and bingos. In Britain, it's complicated because we also have gongos, which are government-organised, non-governmental organisations. But that's beside the point. But what I'm saying is, this kind of technocratic narrative is both very appealing to bingos. ILSI, the International Life Science Institute, is a classic business interest NGO, but it also is useful to the commissioners and the commission staff because it enables them to portray their policy judgments as if they were socially, economically, politically neutral and purely objective and uncontestable. Next slide, okay. Oh yeah, let's skip that one. Life short. We need something to eat and drink. Oh yes, these prior upstream policy judgments that frame risk assessments, they're important, they're always present, they're rarely acknowledged, they're often decided by people called risk assessors, so policy judgments masquerade as if they were scientific, but they're of at least three kinds. As I say, they're substantive, procedural, interpretive. So substantive, yes, what counts as a risk? Oh yeah, I gave you the GM example. Let me give you another one, another food one. Emulsifiers are a category of food additive. They're regulated under EU law by the Commission on the basis of the advice from the European Food Safety Authority. And when they're assessed, they have always and only been assessed in purely toxicological terms. The question that gets asked is, are they toxic? That's a legitimate question, but that's not the entire issue. They may have other important impacts on public health. We all know that one of the most important diet-related considerations in public health is overweight and obesity. And if you track the increase in obesity in Europe and compare it to the content of the diet, nutrient content of the diet, it's quite clear that the reason that obesity has been closely correlated and almost certainly causally connected to rises in the oil and fat content of the diet. And what enables oil and fats to be present in the diet in cakes, biscuits, chocolate, ice cream, dessert products, pizzas, and so on and so forth? Emulsifiers. Emulsifiers keep these oils and fats in suspension and contribute substantially to adverse effects on public health. But this is entirely absent from the agenda. It's not on EFSA's agenda. The only people EFSA ask about emulsifiers are toxicologists. And they tend to say, well, they're safe. Actually, lecithin is probably not toxicologically problematic, but I think it may well be problematic in public health terms. But that's not part of the substantive risk assessment policy. They asked toxicologists about it, and curiously enough, toxicologists narrowly focus on toxicological considerations and are completely blind to public health nutritional considerations. So what counts as a risk and what counts as relevant evidence? Yeah. You feed emulsifiers to rats, rats don't get fat if you just feed them the emulsifiers, but you feed them ready-made pizzas and watch them swell. Okay, then you have other assumptions about how to conduct a risk assessment. Is it open or closed? Now, one of the good things that came out of the Food Standards Agency in Britain, and it's not often that I applaud what they do, but they, since 2003, have made it a rule that all their expert advisory committees meet in public. They are open. Now, EFSA, to its credit, is talking about increasing transparency of risk assessment. However, I have heard repeated remarks from members of expert advisory committees in EFSA saying, oh, we couldn't possibly meet in public. We couldn't be expected to be frank if people were listening. Well, I'm sorry, that's just ridiculous. If they want to be trusted, they're going to have to learn to live with proper transparency. And they've got to be open, not opaque, and to be accountable. It's very interesting, though, when Food Standards Agency panels started to be open, I would go to a few meetings. Life's too short to go to all of them. But there was a stunning occasion at which the Committee on Toxicity in London was talking about the possible evidence of possible carcinogenicity of a pesticide. When a member of the Committee on Toxicity, who had at the start of the meeting declared that he had a conflict of interest to the extent that he was a paid consultant to a chemical industry trade association, and he said, when there was evidence of possible carcinogenicity, he said, we, the committee, we have a special responsibility to avoid a false positive. I was the only person in the room who blinked at that. I thought the Committee on Toxicity was there to protect public health, not to bend over backwards to think of reasons to discount evidence of toxicity in favour of the industry. And the rule was the meetings were in public, but the public may not speak until after all decisions have been taken. So at the end of the meeting I said, excuse me, but I was slightly puzzled by that, and none of you seemed to think that that was a non-scientific policy judgment about the interpretation of science, and precisely the opposite of what you should be doing. They all looked quite shocked. But we're scientists, as if nothing but scientific comments could come out of their mouths. Anyway, so there are important questions about procedure, but also about interpretation. Yes. We've got a situation, even at EFSA, even at the World Health Organization, where evidence from animal studies are treated as entirely reliable when they don't show harm, and completely unreliable when they do suggest harm. I'm sorry, if you're going to do the studies on mice and rats, at least interpret them consistently. Sometimes it gets really dreadful. EFSA sometimes said, in an EFSA panel, they'll say, oh, well, there was this study, but there was no statistically significant evidence of an adverse effect. I'm sorry, there were only 6 rats per dose group. And if the standard requirement for statistical significance is less than 1 chance in 20 that it was a random artifact, that means 5 out of 6 could have dropped dead and it wouldn't have counted as statistically significant. So if that isn't a false negative, I don't know what is. Yeah, next, okay. Oh yeah, well, next, done that. That's it, okay. So, I have not simply summed up what was said, but I have followed Martin's invitation to provide a commentary on what was said. I will, and I've also been asked by Martin both to start tomorrow morning with the summary of today and then summarise again at the end. I will try not to repeat myself, but because there will be quite a few members of the European Parliament present tomorrow who aren't here today, if you don't mind, I will take the liberty of reading out that quote from Broughtingham and whatever the name is on how regulatory capture works. Thank you. Let's have something to eat.